Well, good morning. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and also Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I would like to welcome all of you to our 27th annual Hanmusu Colloquium on the Korean Humanities. And our colloquium is the longest and the only colloquium that focuses on the Korean humanities in the metropolitan DC area, where a majority of discussions are focused on security concerns around the Korean peninsula. So this colloquium provides a forum for academic discussion of Korean arts, history, language, literature, and religion in the context of East Asia and the world. And the colloquium series was made possible by an endowment established by the estate of Han Moo-suk, one of Korea's most honored writers, in order to uphold her spirit of openness, curiosity, and commitment to education. And this colloquium was founded by her daughter, Youngi Kim Runo, who is Professor Emeritus of Korean Language and Culture and International Affairs, who's sitting right over there. And she's also currently senior advisor to GWIX. And Professor Kim Runo is not only the founder of this colloquium, but also built Korean Studies at GW and served as a chair of East Asian Languages and Literatures until she retired a few years ago. So we are always grateful to Professor Kim Runo for building the foundation of Korean Studies and her continued support in Korean Studies at GW. So now, this colloquium, Hanmusu Colloquium, continues to be organized by East Asian Languages and Literatures, and GWIX, our institute, supports organizing it. And I would like to thank our co-sponsors who have been generously supporting this colloquium for many years, and they are Korea Foundation, Literature Translation Institute of Korea, and Seeger Center for Asian Studies at GW. This year's colloquium is on, so the title is not there, okay, is on K-pop, K-pop, which I think is very timely as BTS just finished their world tour, and another K-pop star, Super M, debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 albums chart. Well, frankly, I'm not really super excited about Super M because I don't know them, but I am excited about BTS. And even with BTS, it took me such a long time to remember all of their faces, but I think I began to remember their face when I started having my own bias, and which began with Jungkook, and then now it moved to Jimin. And I'm sure at one point I'll be there. All of them will be my bias at one point. All right. In today's colloquium, our speakers will discuss diverse aspects of K-pop, from state-initiated efforts to employ the Korean wave as a currency of self-power to global fan practices that contributes to the transnational flow of popular culture, cultural appropriation, and the production of idols. And today, we are fortunate to have the leading scholars of Korean pop culture and K-pop, but also those who have actively participated in the industry, as either as a producer or founder of the fan club BTS Army. So I assure you that you will not regret spending your time with us today on a Saturday morning as well as afternoon. Hope you can stay until the afternoon. We have a very nice Korean buffet prepared for you during lunchtime. All right, now I would like to thank our speakers for being here with us today, and also thank Professor Emmanuel Kim for his ideas and organizing this year's colloquium, and also our GWIX staff who have worked so hard to make this colloquium possible. All right, so without further ado, now I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker, keynote speaker, Kyung-Hyun Kim. So Professor Kyung-Hyun Kim is currently in the Department of East Asian Studies at UC Irvine. And he is a novelist, scholar, and film producer, and he's the author of many books, and among them, Virtual Hallyu, Korean Cinema of the Global Era, published in 2011, The Remasculinization of Korean Cinema in 2004, and a Korean language novel entitled In Search of Lost G, 잃어버린 지를 찾아서, in 2014, and he has co-produced 2 award-winning feature films, Never Forever in 2007 and The Housemaid 2010. And he's currently completing a monograph entitled Hegemonic Mimicry, Korean Popular Culture of the 21st Century, and a film project entitled The Origins of a detective set during the 1948 Jeju Island massacre. And this was the winner of the 2018 Kofik Award for Best Movie Script. So he's not just a scholar, but he's also a writer, an artist, a film producer. Please welcome Professor Kyung-Hyun Kim.
Thank you, Jizu, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Emmanuel, for picking me up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I was impressed. I told him that I was going to take Uber, but hospitality here runs no bound. As Jizu talked about, I've been working on a book project for the past few years, and I'm just, finishing it. It looks as if it'll come out next year. And this is from my first chapter that I've been thinking about in terms of how to contextualize and maybe a prototype the last few decades of the Korean popular culture. So the title is a little odd, but I focus on two concepts, mimicry, as well as raciality, and I will begin reading here. You guys can hear me okay, right? Okay. Imagine a dystopian world where American cities have been devastated and slummified after a long decade of economic repression and total war. It's difficult because, America never really had a war over the last 150, 160 years. Large numbers of young people are dead, missing, or badly wounded. Survivors, mostly women, children, and the old, are forced to pull themselves together from ruins of concrete slabs, metal scraps, and war ashes. In the midst of starvation, despair, and famine, loss, and separation, the foreign army that has defended these American cities is asked by the humiliated leader to remain and help restore order. Let's just say that the foreign army, for the argument's sake, that has been asked to save these American territories comes from a country across the Pacific, Korea. They speak only Korean, eat only Korean food, and socialize among themselves. Because tens of thousands of Korean lives, while they were here, have been sacrificed to defend American soil, once the war has ended, their R&R is given priority by the American leader. Koreans occupy the best hotels downtown and hold auditions for local singers, musicians, and dancers in vaudeville-type, magic and freak shows. Because talented young American women and men desperately need work to survive the post-war devastation, they audition before panels of Korean military officers. Because Korean soldiers prefer to watch female singers perform on stage, American girls frantically learn the musical scores and lyrics of Korean folk songs on the fly. Korean traditional melodies registering in moody minor pentatonic scale sound foreign to young American ears and are almost impossible to learn because the lyrics are in a language that sounds nothing like any of the more familiar Indo-European languages that they've heard before, let alone English. Yet, because the income generated from each week of work is easily 3 or 4 times the income earned from working at any local farm, you desperately audition for the Koreans, even though you have heard horror stories about long bus rides on unpaved roads, about the sex-deprived soldiers who grope you on stage and later try to whisk you away to Korea. Because your performance is evaluated by Korean military officers who serve as judges, you force yourself to learn new songs by transliterating the lyrics into English alphabet, even though the Korean words make no sense to you. You may pass the first audition, but even when you succeed in touring on stage for a couple of months, you must continue to compete against newer and younger faces who try to take your place each change of season. Each audition requires you to learn new hit songs on the radio in Korean. Mimicking the accent and intonation of each and every Korean word is almost painful. Physical is painful because you have to use different facial muscles to pronounce iotized vowels not familiar in the English language. Ya, yo. And the frequent syllabic assembly of phonemes with preceding consonants of n, g, things like that. And not only that, the psychologically it's difficult because Korean soldiers constantly mock you for each pigeon diction you make. Just when you think you've mastered standard Korean songs, a new wave of hit songs beats, sung in non-standard Korean, now come in vogue. The new songs are recorded in regional dialect this time, which is much more difficult to learn than the songs sung in standard dialect that you've just got to know. But you never lose hope. Soon you'll tell yourself you can fulfill your dream of singing in front of real Korean audiences back in Korea on a beautiful stage in the poshest, most exclusive neighborhood. And we're thinking of the equivalent of Manhattan, Gangnam. You must learn each and every song with a sincere, positive attitude, or else you may not pass the constant test, get kicked off the tour, and lose your livelihood. Today, I begin my talk with a sketch of a scene from what looks like speculative fiction, because not only does this hypothetical reversal of a hierarchical, hegemonic cultural imperialism sound horrifying for us Americans, Koreans, both maybe, but this fictive representation also pointedly dissenters regimes of representation prevalent throughout the 20th century that have heavily prioritized American-centric access while devaluing the peripheries of any other culture, nation, or history that is non-American. Flip the Korean with America in the preceding paragraph, which you've just said, and you get a snapshot of what actually took place during the post-war years in Korea before the Shodan, which is Korean show troops for the U.S. 8th Army, came to an end with the intensification of Vietnam War by the late 1960s. Although the U.S. of the 21st century now espouses more political sensitivity regarding issues of race, this was much less true of the U.S. of the mid-20th century, 75 years ago. When the U.S. military entered the Korean War, then remained there to defend South Korea from further communist aggression, America was still, at the time, a racially segregated nation whose values, cultural identity, and historical determination to bring world peace was cultivated very much in the power of ideologies of white racial superiority. The treatment in other parts of the world of non-white races, along with their cultural identities and languages, as equal to that of white America was at the time unthinkable. Even here it was unthinkable, 1950s. The elimination of racial inequality between blacks and whites was only in the infancy of discussion and still far from reality during the Korean War and its subsequent decade. Despite the fact that blacks-only troops were phased out during the Korean War by, then President Harry Truman, racial discrimination and segregation remained entrenched in the barracks, in social life, and civilian life back home. Until the end of 1970s, camptown clubs for U.S. military personnel in Korea, even in Korea, were segregated. So much so that race riots took place in several of the clubs near Camp Humphreys by blacks who were upset by the de facto policies of segregation by these clubs and their Korean proprietors to separate entertainers and prostitutes who service white soldiers from those who service their black counterparts. As a country, Korea held a strategic geopolitical significance for U.S. policymakers, but the Koreans themselves, right? Korea is important, but Koreans themselves were just the native people who happened to inhabit a location that did not really figure into a discussion for racial equality. For U.S. politicians, Korea, as it remained largely unchanged today, has always been more important as a bulwark against communism than for the people who inhabit it. So this is the year 1919, exactly 69 years after the war, that desegregated blacks from whites for the first time in American history, while making permanent the division of the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel. A Korean minjok, and minjok is, not just national, but it's ethno-national, right? Because min is people and the jok is more tribal character. It's rarely understood beyond the geopolitical significance that it has represented for the past 3/4 of a century, and its economic value to the world's finances and trade. That is until now. This Korean subjectivity, which was at one point cultivated out of the minjok, and it was, when Shin Cheo and Lee Kwang-soo was trying to come up with an understanding of Minjok 100 years ago, it was an ethnic distinction of the Korean people who occupied Korean Peninsula at a time when it suffered from Japanese colonial rule and their descendants, rather than the one that is defined now by more, modern national citizenship of South Korea. But that has never or rarely been given any kind of notice in America. However, the Korean identity as a new, now postmodern, no longer that, pre-modern conjecture of the racialized subjectivity, but now a postmodern enterprise, now creeping into the lives of American youth through its enormously seductive music videos and alluring television dramas, which draw in attention and numbers of enormous numbers likes in the global social media scene, while dominating new culinary and fashion trends. And so the previously intractable Korean identity that once was steeped in this anti-colonial, resistant, proto-ethnic Minjok identity had undergone, I believe, a phase of transformation. This historical ethnic specificity of Korean nationhood has been rendered, in my mind, opaque, which has allowed Korean music, comedies, dramas, and food to flow into the everyday lives of young people living outside Korea, but it had to be, again, rendered opaque, the Minjok identity. When Korean entertainers first picked up their electronic guitars and sang into the microphones, in order to sell their talent to Americans throughout the 20th century, their Minjok identity had to be compromised. After 70 years in the era of social media, Koreans continued their export initiative-driven production of music videos that has largely repressed their ethnic identity. The several decade-old pursuit of a musical 무국적, the non-national identity, or in some way pseudo-American one, has manufactured success that is unprecedented elsewhere in the world. K-pop is one of the most popular music genres in the world today, and you don't need me to tell you that. The ironic effect is quite evident when Korean entertainment companies now hold auditions to select their new trainees. Many young singers, dancers, talents from all over the world make their pilgrimage to Korea. They're sometimes asked to perform before the Korean judges only a few miles. I mean, it's really a few miles away from Yongsan, the very spot where auditions were held for Koreans to entertain the occupying American military personnel. Gangnam is, again, very close to Yongsan or Itaewon, right? Just across the bridge. These days, despite the recent diplomatic and economic war brewing between South Korea and Japan, many young Japanese art talents even, some of them established stars in their own country, learn new songs in Korean to compete against local Korean talents. The putatively post-ethnic rendering of Korean language customs, rhythm, beats, and themes have permitted these cultural products aestheticized, performed, and enacted by Koreans in the 21st century to reach a quasi-global and what I call ambivalently hegemonic status. My term mimicry is derived from Homi K. Bhabha's seminal article of Mimicry in Men, The Ambivalence of Colonial Discourse, where he argued that the colonial subject is a product of, I quote here, this is Bhabha talking, reformed recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is almost the same but not quite. Almost the same but not quite. The globalization that took place during the post-World War II years had to do with a new form of mass culture constructed under the rubric of undeniably American identity. But whether American cultural artifacts, styles, and pop products remained the same after Koreans had learned them as their own America, Mi국, as Koreans called the United States, or not, is debatable. Between the source, that is America, and the copy, that is Mi국, a slippage, again, and misappropriation were undeniably interjected, despite the best efforts by Koreans to replicate the American performances. This simultaneous appropriation and maybe unintended misappropriation opened doors for innovation. There was probably no other place in the era of Pax Americana outside the US where the learning of the American, the aesthetic styles, language, and so on, was as intense and durable, because it was, again, 75 years, right, as it was in Korea over the past 3/4 of a century. Koreans learned to enact, in other words, a two-step double gesture of mimicking as well as, at the same time, innovating, which immersed this Onmiguk in the Korean movement's rhythm and language. This process of Migukification, both weakened and intensified the Korean emotions and soul, which for many years ended up playing hide and seek with Korea's survival acts of mimicry. Thus, one can argue that South Korea has exploited a close socio-political alliance with the U.S. over the past several decades that have produced a simulation of American conceptional culture, one that decoded and at the same time rendered opaque the local Koreanness before it began circulating through global social media over the last 20 years. If Baba's post-colonial employment of the term mimicry sought to question the level of success of the cultural appropriation, the colonial and post-colonial elites who were forced to adapt by raising the impossibility of approximation in every act of simulation and imitation, I'm particularly interested in how there are other instances of the use of mimicry that come to define the Korean experience or other experience. And I'm looking at, I was really drawn to African American scholarship. Here, Henry Louis Gates Jr. theory on the signifying monkey is one trope which references figures of tricksters and talking animals from Black folktales and verbal games of exchanging insults, such as dozens, which became, evolved into a dissing game in rap culture, in order to foreground the importance of game and playing the instances of Black culture production. Here, mimicry becomes a crucial tool to upset not just one form of power, but all forms of power. Gates theories valorize and reauthenticate parody, mass theater, and taunting that constantly seek to destruct power to the extent where much of the essences of power disintegrates, just by the process, just by the virtue of mimicking. Gates' observation of signifying, which broadly includes imitation jokes and even travesty, as a critical practice, cultural practice, exhibits the pleasure of liberty that is at stake within the discourse of mimicry. This is consistent with what I thought also a French theorist that I'm looking at these days, Roger Caillois, who's argued for the concept of mimicry as a defining, it's like the central core of human nature to play. Okay? It's not just African American, it's not just Korean, it's in our nature. And how do we go about thinking about this more, intellectually, for the lack of a better word? When the logical capital to follow the words of Stuart Hall, and this is Hall, would translate everything in the world into a kind of replica of itself, South Korea excelled by not by repackaging its local culture for the modern medium, but by surreptitiously and implicitly referencing its old cultural impulses when reenacting American styles, music, and trends. Especially over the first decade of 21st century, last 20 years, Koreans' acceptance of Americanization and commercialization helped to overcome their own deep internal contradictions between global and local, and effectively allowed them to transcribe its own cinematic language, music genres, and even ideology that originated in America. Yes, it comes from America, but now into powerful discourse that we now brush aside along with the coinage of Hallyu. However, what needs to be recognized here is that this first step, or active appropriation cum double gesture, that at least had to acknowledge and abandon its own minjok, was not just a national reenactment, but a reconstitution of itself as a proto-ethnic identity within the pan-American global order. So I wanted us to think in Hallyu in terms of, again, not just Korean discourse, but global American discourse. Okay, how does it fit in? The unraveling of the boundary between authenticity and quotation gesture through the Korean act of mimicry, in other words, proclaimed the birth of a new ethnic and national subjectivity that is both American and Korean, which is racial politically also located somewhere between off-white, and here I say off-white in terms of, and I say complicit, and Blackish, which is, to me, more resistant. And it wavers between the two, complicity and resistance. Throughout the book that I've been working on, I offer these two terms, off-white and Blackish, as a discourse that tries to read these two colors as metonymic, not metaphoric, but metonymic references to suggest a two-headed condition of hegemony that inseparably inarticulates the Antonio Gramscian tropes of coercion and subversion. This is another thing. Which is another way of saying complicity and resistance. How this new identity trap between neo-colonial subjectivity and a post-colonial one became rearticulated into a dominant wave of culture, whereas new act of the day, BTS for instance, has totally subverted this dominant hierarchy between original and copy and can now even rival several of the top American music acts such as Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber. In terms of album downloads, YouTube views, and concert ticket sales, is what forms my theoretical frame of hegemonic mimicry. In other words, what my study aims at is, there are three things. First, to situate Korean popular culture of the past 2 decades as one of the most discernible and copious examples of the blurred boundary between original and copy, and that has rendered the catalog of postmodern cultural contents par excellence. So, we know postmodernism is about blurring of the boundaries between original and copy, but obviously you have to look at Koreans, right, and K-pop and K-dramas and Korean cinema to really realize this is actually happening. Yeah. Second, to explore the phenomena that made this K-pop fame possible, not only including the ingenuity and persistence of Korean artists and cultural innovators who notoriously spent countless hours in training, but also because the global culture dominated by social media over the past decades has empowered users' parody, fandom, and remakes, which in turn have weakened the traditional borders between nations, languages, and the originality and copy divide. Obviously, social media has allowed us to do that. Third, what I would like to also insist in this process of Korea's act of creative mimicry, as I call it hegemonic mimicry, is a recognition of Korean reclamation of both the proto and post-Minjok identity. It's both the beginning regurgitation as well as maybe this, maybe redefined, post-Minjok identity that has rendered opaque its national identity for its very survival, and which has shadowed many of the Korean performances, experience, and cultural utterances of the modern age. I consider race, along with national identity, and we talk about national identity a lot, but I really want to talk about race here as one that is, yes, opaque and maybe not as visible and not as transparent, but still very important. And I wanted to point attention to throughout my book as one of the most important, if not the most important, criteria through which K-pop and other cultural waves of 21st century has enacted. I'm getting kind of bored reading this. So I'm going to, I've been reading it like a lot. So I'm going to skip a few pages. The Korean wave of the past 20 years, maybe the first time a post-colonial Asian Minjok became a critical voice in the makeup of a global pop culture that has leaped over the linguistic and cultural walls that surround the minor culture. And I make an argument in the book. Yes, there's Bollywood, there's reggae, but they also constitute a language block, you see. Hindu, English, in the case of Bollywood, because Bollywood, a lot of it is English already, and maybe Commonwealth culture, and reggae, to also be part of certain kind of Commonwealth culture, Jamaica, English, and in the case of obviously K-pop or K-drama, it's the first time you have a registering of a real hegemonic, ambivalent hegemonic culture that is created out of minor language. However, it has achieved this success by rendering, again, the ethnic background opaque. This opacity of ethnicity is precisely the reason K-cultural industry can be considered both racialized and non-racialized. Yeah, you can point to, that's why both arguments work. No, it's not that racial, but yes, it's racial, right? The fact that Koreans had to overcome traumas of the extended period of modern-day slavery during colonialism, and also spectacular forms of nationwide corruption and trauma during the Cold War, the anti-communist campaigns and military dictators and so forth, during the 20th century, in order to open 21st century as a nation rich in soft power, probably is not coincidental. Just as much as blackness can now not just represent the wound of black men from the 19th century or even 20th century, but signify a new signature of cool that engages and sets trend of current global culture. Koreanness had to also overcome its own trauma, or the Han, during the previous era in order to extend its power of, mut, the fashionable trend to the rest of the world today. When Achille Mbembe insisted in his discussion on blackness that the 21st century is, of course, not the 19th century, to make the distinction that the modern-day welfare of blacks has to be differently engaged from that of the days of slavery, he could have well been talking about not just about blacks, but for Koreans as well. We equally suffer from, this is contestable, but also suffered a lot, right? During long years of oppression during the previous century, 20th century for Koreans was just a mess. My study then seeks not only to scratch the surface of many of the films, popular cultural texts, and even songs to decode the opaque racialization of Koreans therein, but also to lay a foundation, and I hope you can also see it as well, not only through my study, but studies of your own, to understand this new racialized consciousness of Koreanness in the 21st century. The Korean ethnic identity that was born out of a post-1945 neo-colonial experience with the U.S. was different from that of the post-colonial identity defined by Baba and Hall, whose scholarship was shaped by English colonial experience in India and in Jamaica within the span of their parents' generation's lifetime. Baba was born, 1945 or thereabout, and Stuart Hall probably 1930s. The style of Bollywood filmmaking that began in the post-war, post-independence India also reshaped global music, fashion and food, and continues to impact contemporary global culture today. While the reggae and Rastafarian fads from Jamaica that shook the world by storm in the 1970s have sustained their popularity and global influence well into the 21st century. However, these cultural phenomena initially served largely, as I said, the Anglophone and global ethnic population that motivated fandom across regions that shared common cultural heritage. The unique and ironic, perhaps, characteristic of Korean popular culture is that its cultural essence has been carved out by a Korean language, a minor language spoken only by 70 million people. And if you don't necessarily want to count North Koreans, for they don't participate in this, it's only 50 million of them, right? Among a global population, it's just huge, 7-8 billion people. That's only 1%, right, or less. This opaque raciality or anti-raciality that Koreans and Korean cultural production, many in Korean language, mostly in Korean language, represent, helps to establish an ambivalent cultural hegemony in other countries that do not feel as threatened by this globally opaque Koreanness. Come on, there are only 50 million people out there, right? As a complement sometimes, but also resistant to the American cultural domination. So now, I think it is time for us to recognize and uncover and reawaken this racial potential. The term Minjok had always laid is dormant underneath the mat of nationalism, because it has been nationalism that always has been associated with Minjok, and underneath maybe the racialized one. to why. Why do you want to do this? I think to seek better ties, because I think recognizing raciality allows us to seek better ties rather than nationalities. Okay, the insistence of focusing on nationalities within K-pop, K-drama, and K-cinema and elsewhere. So that's my project, and thank you for listening for the past 30 minutes.